Excellencies, colleagues, it is a great honour to join you at the launch of this important report by the Independent International Panel on Arbitrary Detention in State-to-State Relations. Thank you to Canada for leading the initiative on arbitrary detention and state hostage-taking, and for the invitation to speak. Allow me to begin by commending the panel members for their rigorous legal analysis and the moral clarity of their conclusions. This work represents a strong contribution to our collective efforts to address one of the most insidious and under-acknowledged crimes, that of the deliberate harm to human beings as instruments of political leverage. All forms of hostage-taking, whether by state or non-state actors, violate our shared system of human rights, the rule of law, and global peace and security. But when states themselves engage in this practice, when they use their own officials and legal systems for coercion and abuse, they have surpassed acceptable behaviour in interstate relations. Clearly, hostage-taking has a direct and profound effect on victims and survivors. However, it also clearly corrodes the art of diplomacy, weakens international cooperation, and entrenches distrust between states. It should therefore be of particular concern of all member states of the United Nations. Earlier this year, I presented a thematic report to the Human Rights Council on hostage-taking as a form of torture, document number A/HRC/58/88. I thank the panel of experts for the various citations in their own report. My report examined both state and non-state hostage-taking. It was not hard to conclude that the suffering inflicted on hostages and their families invariably involves forms of torture, from the initial abduction to the conditions in which detainees are held, including the purposeful intention to injure, to subject them to degrading conditions, or to detain them indefinitely, are all forms of torture or other prohibited ill treatment. I further concluded that the families of victims should be granted special legal status and that governments should establish appropriate consular liaison functions that can deal with the complexity of these cases. Ladies and gentlemen, we have seen a marked and alarming rise in state hostage-taking. Hostage Aid Worldwide has reported that from 2000 to 2019, such cases increased by more than 1,200%. By the end of 2024, 39 states were reported to be holding hostages or unlawfully detaining foreign or dual nationals for political leverage. Sometimes states are propping up the unlawful actions of companies. Sometimes states are complicit or are even directly involved in hostage-taking committed by armed or terrorist groups. The latter is another dimension of this challenge that should not be overlooked in your deliberations. Behind these statistics are individuals and their families who suffer unimaginable pain. Hostages have reported to me about being held in deplorable conditions, in out-of-sight detention facilities, being forced to negotiate for food and water, and starved, to stay silent, make no noise, don't complain, no contact with anyone, no family visits or very few. Sometimes total isolation, deprived of freedom, only living with their own thoughts, and many beaten, subjected to terrible cruelty, sexual assaults, and fear. Fear of what is going to happen next. Fear they may never be released. Fear they may be raped. Fear for the next round of abuse. Fear they may be killed or die in detention. Fear that their families may never know what happened to them. Families have told me too how powerless they feel, kept in the dark by their own governments, not clear if or what their governments are doing to secure the release of their loved one. Governments may not always be able to decide if it is a hostage event or a detention, but failing to take a decision cannot be acceptable. That must change, and governments must err on the side of the alleged victim until established otherwise. Even if their situation is deemed not to be definitionally hostage-taking, or a wrongful detention, I remind all states that all persons deprived of their liberty must be treated humanely and with respect at all times, and foreign nationals have the right of consular assistance. The physical and psychological torment does not end with the victim's release, however. It reverberates through families, communities, and nations. Former hostages have told me about being left to recover on their own. No procedures for returning and reintegrating victims, not even proper medical checks. Thankfully, some countries that have more experience have developed good practices, but many hostages feel abandoned by their own governments and forgotten. It adds insult to injury. That too must change. Family reunion, sometimes years after an abduction, is at first a jubilation. Later, the dedicated work of recovery must begin. Children are especially vulnerable. Survivors may suffer long-term traumatic stress disorder or other psychological consequences. Physiological harm, such as chronic diseases or development of permanent disabilities, are also recurrent problems. The taint of criminal charges, even if false, can follow victims into their futures. Some may no longer be fit for work. To that end, both my report and the panel's report converge on key recommendations for action. First, states must recognise arbitrary detention for political or diplomatic leverage as state hostage-taking and use that terminology more consistently. Only by naming the practice properly can we begin to combat it effectively. Second, states should acknowledge hostage-taking as a form of torture, thereby bringing such cases squarely within the framework of the Convention Against Torture and the Jus Cogens obligation to prohibit and prevent torture in all its forms. Third, states must criminalise hostage-taking as well as torture in domestic laws, investigate and hold perpetrators accountable, exercise universal jurisdiction, and provide redress and rehabilitation to victims and their families. This should include medical, psychological, legal, and financial support. Fourth, states must strengthen and fully implement the International Convention Against the Taking of Hostages. I would also encourage states to endorse the Declaration Against Arbitrary Detention in state-to-state relations and join efforts to universally condemn and take action against all forms of hostage-taking. And fifth, this issue must find a place in the ongoing negotiations for the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Crimes Against Humanity, to ensure that hostage-taking is clearly criminalised under international law. When it is part of a widespread or systematic attack against a civilian population, it is a crime against humanity. Please make sure that it is incorporated into the next draft text. International institutions, too, have a role to play. The General Assembly, the Human Rights Council, and importantly, the Security Council should each address the issue and specific situations and individuals through dedicated resolutions and debates, recognizing its growing threat to international peace and security. I'd be open to collaborating with the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, who could consider adopting a deliberation specifically on hostage-taking. Treaty bodies and special procedures should integrate, and I encourage them to integrate this issue into their work. I have also proposed the creation of an international fund to support victims and families and the appointment of a UN special representative to assist in hostage negotiations, represent the interests of victims and survivors and their families, and to coordinate global action, a position that is clearly leading to a vacuum. A neglect of this issue has allowed this terrible crime to go unremarked upon and to flourish in recent decades. It needs to be spotlighted better and addressed in all its forms. I appreciate the work being pursued by many member states, and I would be pleased to continue to support your efforts. The panel's report is an important step forward, and I congratulate the experts again. Thank you for your attention.